Yeah, I'm sorry about the lighting here. We have the benefit of some late afternoon sun down in Bournemouth, and it plays a bit of havoc with the Zoom. So yeah, I'm going to talk about rocks and hard places. And what I'm saying is prompted, of course, by Heidi's case, by her campaign. But I'm not going to talk about the details, well, generally not about the details of the case. I want to talk about the context in which the case and the campaign are being pursued, the ethical context. Now, I know one of the speakers this morning said that there seems to be a dearth of ethics, and that might be a problem. I mean, there might not be enough ethics, that's true. But that's not the context that I want to focus on. There is, I mean, I think in most places I find myself, there is a serious ethical conversation going on. The problem is that there are a plurality of views in that context, that although everybody agrees that what they ideally want to do is do the right thing, there are at least three major different views, conflicting views about the criteria for doing the right thing. And so this means that those who have governance responsibilities find themselves caught in a kind of trilemma, or out of three conflicting ethical views being put at them. Whatever they decide, it's not going to suit everybody. And about 20 years ago, you may remember the case of the conjoined twins, Jodie and Mary, where if they separated the girls, one of the girls was going to die. But if they didn't separate the girls, then both girls would die. That was the medical prognosis. The parents who'd come from the Mediterranean declined to give consent, but it went to the High Court, eventually to the Court of Appeal for decision. And, you know, understandably, one of the justices, Lord Justices in the Court of Appeal, Lord Justice Ward, said that this was an agonizing decision to make, and that whichever decision the court made, it wasn't going to suit everybody. Some people would applaud it, but some people would find it deeply offensive. And I think you could say much the same about Heidi's case, that some people might applaud what the judges in the High Court decided in the judicial review, but a lot of people, as we've heard this morning, find it deeply upsetting and very offensive, understandably. So there's a problem here, to my mind, not so much that we have a dearth of ethics, but the ethics we have aren't all harmonious and complementary and make it possible for us to come to decisions which everyone is entirely content with. This is a recipe for discontent. And it's a real problem for us if we're trying to govern in a way which achieves a just order, an order that we can respect, an order that we think reflects good governance. So I'm going to just say a few words about the nature of the plurality, and then I'll talk about how we engage with the plurality. That is those who have governance responsibilities, but also those who are campaigning for a change in the law and who have to encounter the plurality on the other side, as it were. And then I'll say something about good governance. And there's no good end to this story. It's it's complex, it's difficult, it's challenging. I don't have a silver bullet, but this is the way it is. It seems to me, it's a reality check. And okay. So to start with the plurality now. You might think, oh well, it's kind of pro-life versus pro-choice, and whether you're looking at a case like Heidi's or any other abortion case, or whether you're looking at assisted suicide, where I myself have been active in those debates, trying to campaign for a change in the law, you find that there's more to it actually than pro-life and pro-choice. Those are strong features, but there are three answers to the question: what do we have to do if we're going to do the right thing? The first answer is, well, try and do the good, try and do something that's good, produce good consequences. And if you were having artificial intelligence geared up to do ethics, for sure, you'd be trying to get it to optimize on some kind of good that the programmers had determined was the thing to be optimized. Now, of course, in the UK, where we have a strong utilitarian tradition, utility is generally speaking the good that people have in mind, but it's not necessarily utility. It could be equality. It could be the interests of women. It could be all sorts of things. But there's a good to be maximized or bad to be minimized. Trying to do good. Try and do good. And I think it's important to understand that the implicit, often unstated ethic of public health is just that they're trying to do good for everyone by improving the conditions for public health in the community. And I don't think there's much doubt that public health interventions have made a huge difference to the basic infrastructure for our life prospects. And of course, the language that goes with this is about benefits and harms, and but it is an ethic. It is an ethic. This is a view about what's the right thing to do. And in public health, it is the dominant ethic. Now, the second answer to the question is that you do the right thing if you respect people's rights. Respect people's rights. And that has become, I would say, the dominant ethic in medical law. And of course, where in litigation or any other kind of argument you try and tap into human rights, then what you're trying to tap into is this rights ethic. This is where pro-choice belongs. This is where the right to reproductive autonomy belongs. There was a question in the previous session about don't people have a right to know? I think Jonathan asked this question. Well, there were two questions. Jonathan asked the second one, I think. Isn't there, in effect, a right to know? It doesn't mean you're going to act on what you know by terminating the pregnancy. You could just be trying to prepare yourself for the child that's going to be born. Make sure you're fully prepared. Goodness knows, I know my own experience. Even with all the advantages, you weren't properly prepared. So can we be better prepared? And isn't there a right to know, particularly when this is information that, and if it belongs to anybody, it seems to belong to you. The second answer to the question is that the right thing to do is to respect rights. And now the third answer to the question is that the right thing to do is to act in accordance with one's duties. These might be duties to others, in which sense this looks rather like the other side of a rights theory, but it could be duties to the self. And of course, in the history of ethics, in the modern ethics, the conflict or tension between Benthamite utilitarian ethics and Kantian duty-based ethics was where most textbooks would have started their exposition of the ethics. But nowadays, and particularly in the period from, say, 1950 onwards, I would say, the rights ethic, or the idea of individual autonomy, of people having informed choices, of consent being crucial, that ethic has become really very, very important. So we now found ourselves in a situation where we have, as I say, public health thinking dominated by by utilitarian kind of ethics. We have generally medical care, particularly after the Montgomery case of the Supreme Court a few years back, dominated, I'd say, by a rights ethic. Then we have a cluster of duty-based ideas kicking around, which include kind of professional paternalism, but duty to look after patients, to do what you judge to be in their best interests. But we also have a kind of conservative dignitarian ethic, which has supporters from various constituencies. That, I suggest, is where Heidi and her campaign is actually based. But what they're arguing for is a duty-based ethic, which is about inclusiveness, about solidarity, about responsibility, about caring, about lots of things which they get pushed to one side when you start prioritizing informed choice or autonomy. In the 1990s, I was part of a European-funded bioethics project where the Europeans wanted to put up a rival scheme of ethics, bioethics, against the dominant North American scheme, which was a scheme, the Beecham and Childress scheme, which was about individual autonomy, about beneficence, non-maleficence, and about justice. But where autonomy was really a very, very dominant voice in that ethic. And although the Europeans didn't want to write autonomy out of the script, they were particularly concerned to talk about dignity, human dignity, about vulnerability, and about integrity. So that became the DIVA scheme: dignity, integrity, vulnerability, autonomy. Resulted in something called the Barcelona Declaration. You can still find it online if you check it out. But that was an attempt to try to articulate a duty-based set of ethics for Europe. There was a counterpoint to what was clearly becoming the dominant rights-based ethic. And about 20 years ago, I was advising the House of Lords Select Committee on human embryonic stem cell research and cloning. And medical researchers, thinking like utilitarians, were extremely enthusiastic about this research being facilitated because, yeah, I mean, they saw all sorts of cures for Parkinson's, pretty much every human disease you can think of in the pipeline here. And the rights theorists were on side with this, provided the individuals who were going to supply their embryos for research were giving their informed consent. Why shouldn't they contribute to a research project? So kind of utilitarians and right people were pretty much on the same side, but there was stern resistance extremely stern resistance from people in the dignitarian camp on the duty-based side. And a lasting impression for me was where we were taking evidence one day and a lady in a wheelchair was giving evidence, and she said, look, I don't care whether all the promises that are being made by the researchers here could be fulfilled, and that I could have some sort of stem cell therapy, which would mean I could get up and walk again. She said, I still think it's just categorically wrong to be using human embryos in this way, just categorically wrong. That, I mean, so if you're trying to measure the depth of feeling that goes with particular ethics, where people are arguing from the duty-based starting point, they often argue very deep indeed. Human dignity is not kind of just a surface utility. Human dignity cuts a really deep indeed. Now, rather like a kaleidoscope, the configuration or the pattern of this, you know, these three ethical viewpoints changes from time to time, from place to place, from topic to topic. In the debates about abortion, about termination, generally speaking, it's the duty people who are arguing for change, and well, they're getting resistance mainly from the rights people, but also from some utilitarians. In the assisted suicide debate that I said, you know, I played some part in, we were arguing from a rights perspective, trying to change the law, and the main opposition against that was a duty-based perspective, exactly the other way around, you know, and just the way that this, as I call it, bioethical triangle configures, does vary from time to time, place to place, and topic to topic. But that's the plurality we're dealing with. Okay, how do we live with it? How do we engage with it? And for governors, those who have responsibilities for governance, how can they, can they avoid being between rocks and hard places? I'll mention three things that they might do on the governance side, and then I'll mention three strategies or approaches or responses from the side of the governed. To start with the governors, one thing they might do, I think a very important thing indeed, is trying to make as much room as possible for conscientious objection. Because in a moral community that takes its ethics seriously, you don't want to compel people to act against their conscience. That, you know, even where there's a plurality, you can avoid doing that. That's something you'd rather not do. And of course, the Abortion Act in 1967 does have a conscience clause in it, but it's set up in a way that talks about participating in treatment, offending the conscience, and people being excused then. Where that conscience clause has come up for interpretation in our courts, and particularly at the highest level, and most recently in the Glasgow Hospital case, the Dugan case, in, I think 2015, the court gives the conscience clause a very narrow interpretation. They say that the way they read the legislative intent back in 1967, I don't know how they could do that, but they purport to rest it on that ground, which is, of course, the way we do rest our reading of legislation. But, you know, I'd say if you've got any doubt about a conscience clause, you should give it the widest margin possible. And even if it might have been inconvenient in the Dugan case, to allow the claimants there to have, you know, some flexibility given their conscience, I'd say that's a small price to pay for, you know, avoiding compelling people to act against their conscience, or forcing them out of the job. So one thing is to make good use of conscience clauses. There are other things they could do to ease the tensions, but I think that's the most important thing. The second thing they might try to do, at least where you're talking about the question being raised in the court, like in Heidi's case, is do something that Eloise picked up when she was introducing this morning, which is, I think, in paragraph 5 of the judgment, almost the opening gambit from the court is, oh, well, of course, this is a court of law, not a court of morals. And what that's saying is, although there might be some ethics inscribed in the law, and of course, human rights ethics here, we don't have to worry about ethics outside the law. And indeed, that's exactly what they said in the conjoined twins case that I mentioned about Jodie and Mary. They said exactly the same thing there, that this is a terribly difficult case, but we have to decide it on the basis of the law. Now, they don't always say that. I'd say that if you were counting up the number of instances where that's been said, as opposed to the view that you have to take account of morals as well as law, that it's a court of law, not a court of morals, would win that one quite comfortably. But there have been instances where judges have said, no, you can't just decide this on the narrow ground of law. You have to take account of the ethical considerations too. And the clearest example of this is that you said, well, point me to an example, would be the well-known case of Tony Bland. He was, if you remember, one of the victims of the Hillsborough football disaster, diagnosed after the disaster as being in a persistent vegetative state. The hospital and the family thought that further hydration, was further feeding and hydration was futile. But there were people in the hospital who were worried about withdrawing the feeding and the hydration. So the court was asked in a test case to rule on this. And it went all the way up to the House of Lords. All levels, all judges decided that it would be lawful to withdraw feeding and hydration. But along the way, Lord Hoffman, as he was at the time, Lord Justice Hoffman, as he was at the time in the Court of Appeal, wrote a very memorable judgment, I thought, in which he said, well, on a question like this, you can't just say, well, this is what the law decrees. You have to take account of the ethics as well. But of course, whichever way you call it on that, whether you say, like the judges in Heidi's case, this is a court of law, not a court of morals, or whether you take the Hoffman approach, you're between rocks and hard places, because you're going to have critics, whichever way you call it. I mean, people would say in Heidi's case, well, surely that's too narrow. You can't just, not decide this on the basis of the law. But if you then open it all up to, well, the law plus ethics, you say, hang on a minute, what mandate do you judges have for writing your own reading of the nation's morality into the legal judgments? We have, that's kind of what we have laws for. They close the issue. And again, Eloise in the question and answers, I think, was making some comments about the authority that courts might have or the capacity that courts have relative to legislative assemblies. And you might say, well, in functioning democracies, these questions really need to be put back to Parliament rather than having judges try to decide them. It's a tricky question. But again, I say, you've got rocks and hard places. So I'm not sure that that's too easy an answer. Then the third thing that the governors might try to do is say, well, okay, we're aware that there are people who, there's a rights constituency, there's a duty constituency, there's a kind of utilitarian camp. We're not going to talk about it later. Let's talk about process. Let's talk about how we're going to arrive at a decision. And we want a process that has integrity, it's inclusive, we're going to hear all the voices that there are on this, and then we're going to try and arrive at a reasonable or not unreasonable accommodation of what we expect to be conflicting views that we get to hear. And this is the modus operandi of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. So when they did their report, which you heard about this morning on NIPT, and the ethical issues to which NIPT gives rise, the Nuffield Council, of course, consulted in the usual way. And in their report, then, they said, well, basically, we heard some conflicting things across the spectrum. We heard about the importance of reproductive autonomy and women's rights or couples' rights. We heard about harm to unborn children. And we heard about the need for solidarity and inclusivity and equality and that sort of thing, and being sensitive to the views of the larger disability community. And they came up with some proposals which were fairly conservative. Those questions that Chris was putting to us, or questions that were put about like late onset diseases or sex selection. The Nuffield Council report weren't sort of going gung-ho at all for having NIPT widely available. They were being pretty cautious with it. But, in the classic way, you then find yourself being assailed on both wings, because people who are very strong on women's rights, either to make decisions about termination or just to know, or the utilitarians who think that there's some overall benefit to be achieved by NIPT because it can be used earlier to test the status of the fetus and maybe then can avoid a more invasive procedure later on in the pregnancy. They're not going to like this. They think NIPT should be more widely available. But on the other hand, those people on the other wing, coming from Heidi's sort of starting point, are not going to like the way that the Nuffield Council is even sort of putting his foot into the water. But at the same time, the UK National Screening Committee was also thinking about what to do with NIPT. And again, we heard quite a lot about that this morning. And I will emphasize that I'm just talking personally here, even though I am on the NSC. The NSC was talking about integrating NIPT into the existing pathway and into the existing screening pathway, giving women the option. It wasn't going to, it was very, very cautious not to try to roll out NIPT more broadly than that, because the only women who were going to be offered the option of NIPT were women who would already show as being high risk on the combined test, which is the test that's used early on in that pathway. But again, I mean, this, believe me, the NSC is between a rock and a hard place, because and you will find in print some pretty damning reviews of the work of the NSC from healthcare practitioners, from medics, who think that we don't approach the recommendations we make to government in a sufficiently utilitarian way. I mean, at the same time, we are getting criticised from the other wing by those, including the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, who think that the NSC doesn't do enough to take account of these wider societal issues, like the impact this might have on the disability community. Well, you perhaps know the NSC has recently published, for the first time, explicitly an ethical framework for its decision making, and I worked with Catherine Johnson, who was on secondment from the Nuffield Council with Public Health England at the time, and I hope that that ethical framework will at least signal that we do take ethics seriously and that we are conscious of the criticisms. But the trouble is, the criticisms are being made from both wings, and we're stuck in the middle of it. So we're in the crossfire here. Now, I wanted to say a word or two as well about how the plurality looks if you are coming at it from the side of the governed and the discontent. You're not very happy about the way the law stands, or and one thing you could do, okay, first thing, do what Heidi's team have done, run a judicial review and see whether you can find a peg in human rights law to hang the argument about discrimination on. As we know, the court really didn't give any encouragement for this, and I'm not at all surprised. Here in Bournemouth, I'm about a 5-minute walk from the beach on the west side of Bournemouth, and if I walk west, I usually walk into a very strong prevailing wind, and I can get along the beach there in 3 miles walk, but it's a hard going. I'm going into the wind, and I think that's what Heidi's legal team were doing when they ran the case, because the headwind there of human rights is right against you if you're trying to say we want to have some restrictions introduced into the abortion laws, right against them. In terms of the bioethical triangle, here we have people coming out of a duty-based argument, trying to plead it in terms of rights. I'd say crazy, well, not crazy, but long shot. If that is going to work, I'll be amazed. I mean, occasionally, the Strasbourg court does smuggle dignitarian ideas into a rights framework through the back door, but it's very occasional, and it's possible. I mean, it is possible that I suppose this might just might get some support, but I really don't think so. You're looking for a different kind of argument here, and I mean, even, with the assisted suicide arguments, where the courts are largely on side, even there, you can't be sure that, you're gonna get the argument home on a human rights basis, on a pro-choice basis. So, well, if that's not the best strategy, what is the? Let me talk about a second strategy, which I think has better prospects. Oh, and I should have said as well. Sorry, I didn't know the book that again Eloise quoted Hans Rinder this morning. But just looking at the blurb about that book, that perfectly encapsulates what I've just been saying about going into a kind of liberal human rights headwind with that argument. It's just not going to work normally. That's not the way to turn things round. So no, I would be saying, as someone else has said this morning, just look at where we were in 1967 and look at where we are in 2022 and in relation to the law and the practice. Now, I know the law has been tweaked. I'm not sure it's been tweaked otherwise in 1990, but there has been some adjustments to the law. But really, if you go back to 1967, I would have said, we're moving from a prohibition to a permission, but we're not. The permission is heavily qualified, heavily tilted against termination. You've got to show that the grounds for termination are as set out in the legislation, one of the grounds. And you have to get two doctors, as again Eloise said, to good faith to sign it off. If you said, well, that looks to me like abortion on demand in 1967, I think you say, well, come on, have you read the acts? Have you listened to the Parliament? I mean, where have you been? That can't be so. But in 2022, if I were to say, well, it looks to me like in practice it's abortion on demand, I'd say, well, yeah, it pretty much is, isn't it? In name, that's what we've got. And we've traveled. Our practice has traveled a long, long way, it seems to me, from where we were in 1967. And if I'd been someone in 1967, like coming from a dignitarian duty-based perspective, thinking that termination was not an ethical thing to do, except maybe in cases of rape or whatever, or something like this, but generally being very much against it, I think I would have been horrified to see where we've got to. I think I would have felt that, those people who were saying, oh, you're on the slippery slope here, you wait and see, they would have been right. And so how do you, well, legally, you need to try to sort of go back to anchor the argument to the intent back there in 1967. And in the US Supreme Court, one of the justices there, Antonin Scalia, famously persuaded the court to go in for kind of originalist interpretations, that very old bits of law were being read in a way that the founders had expressed them. And if you were to do that, or at least to wrap that up in terms of what the parliamentary intent was back in 1967, I think you'd say that the practice here has escaped. That the doctors have signed things off in a way that was never really envisaged. And of course, the world's changed too. The techniques for conducting abortions and the social attitudes around it have all changed. So you could say, well, doctors were kind of just going with the flow. I think that that there will be a case for saying there that there is a big gap between what was intended back in 1967 and practice today. But the problem is that that originalist style of interpretation is not the one that I think would prevail in our courts, because we also have a school of thought which is that the legislation, the candidates here usually have been Victorian legislation, but legislation is, as it were, always speaking to us, always speaking. And that's saying, there has to be some sort of evolution that goes with the legislation. And so that when judges are invited to interpret these older statutes, they should try and interpret them in a contemporary context. I think wherever you stand on the abortion debate or particular aspects of it, there is a rule of law concern here, which is that the law as expressed on the statute book doesn't look like the law in practice. And when I get to the conclusion in a few minutes, I'm going to say I think probably we do need to have a reset of the abortion law, so that we can bring what the law says in the statute more closely to what the practice is going to be. Another thing that a third strategy for someone who trying to change the law is, as Heidi's doing, to garner public support. And the internet and crowdsourcing or crowdfunding and so on, I mean, social media does change the complexion thing. A lot of people would say that just makes things worse, but there's no doubt that you can attract more interest in a campaign, raise the profile of it this way. And that can be very telling. I mean, remember the case of Diane Blood, who, well, this was happening at a hospital, which I could see from my office in the law department at Sheffield University at the time. And you know, she and her husband, Stephen, had discussed starting a family, but tragically he contracted meningitis and died in the hospital in Sheffield. But shortly before he died, they took some sperm samples from him. And the question legally was whether, a question for the HFEA, was whether it would now be lawful for Diane to have access to those sperm samples for assisted conception, so that she could start the family that she said she and Stephen would like to have had. And the HFEA said, well, you know, this just doesn't pass muster relative to the consent requirements in the Act, and which include a specific consent where you're going to have a posthumous use of sperm. And when it went into the High Court, the judge there said the same thing. The HFEA got this right. But there was a groundswell of public opinion that was right behind Diane Blood's campaign. And I think at the time, it was reckoned in a poll, about 75% of people thought that she should be allowed to have access to the sperm and start a family. When it got to the Court of Appeal, they overturned the High Court decision and said, no, the HFEA needed to reconsider this on a judicial review. Quite extraordinary, I mean, extraordinary judgment, because the reason for this was that the HFEA hadn't failed to take full account of the fundamental freedoms of European community law, which are about freedom of movement of goods and services, freedom of movement of sperm, and the use of clinics, as it turned out, in Belgium. Quite extraordinary. And now, I mean, the HFEA, I understand, was out of money anyway, so couldn't really take the matter much further. But you know, Blood's team were celebrating at the front entrance to the High Court before the HFEA had reconsidered. I think it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to say yes, which they did. And you know, if you've got 75% of the British public behind you on your case, then no matter what the law says, there's going to be a real pressure to do something about this, because otherwise the law will fall into disrepute. These are some of the ways in which those who are campaigning for change might try to get some action. But again, you know, there's none of these are guarantees. As I say, there are no silver bullets here. So let me say a few words about good governance very quickly. My idea of good governance is, first of all, that those who are governing, those who have governance responsibilities, act with integrity. You might say, well, of course, you know that. But in fact, most governance, most parties involved in governance, I think, don't act with integrity, unfortunately, because corruption and capture, are the two main problems we face if what we want is good governance. I mean, the worldwide problems. We're very fortunate in the UK, I would say, that corruption and capture are relatively low levels. But you know, you look in other places and you see that regulation and law is not implemented in the way it should be because of corruption and capture, or again, not sufficient resources to, you know. But there has to be integrity on the part of the government, of those who are governing, and they have to be trying to govern in the interests of those who are governed. But of course, when you say, well, yeah, all right, but what do you mean by the interests of those who are governed? Because we see the ethical plurality will probably give us different answers to that question. Well, I think that there's one thing on which we can all agree, and this is that here we are in our particular human communities debating the rights and wrongs of various things. But we couldn't do any of this unless certain preconditions were in place. And these are what I call the global commons conditions. These are the essential conditions for we humans, first of all, to exist on planet Earth, And they are the essential conditions or context for us to exercise our capacity for agency, to understand who we are ourselves, to think about self-interest and self-development, but also to think about others and their interests, and begin to reason in a moral way, and to begin to form the kind of communities that we want to form. I don't think anybody can rationally deny that those conditions need to be protected and preserved. And of course, they are severely threatened and under stress at the moment, because the kind of things that are going to destabilize the global commons are climate change, pandemics, weapons of mass destruction. Pretty much anything that's been in the news recently is looking like just the kind of thing that should not be happening if we have good governance. And so you could start with that. There's kind of platform or a stage for communities to form in their own particular way. But whichever community you are in, those global commons conditions are non-negotiable. They're cosmopolitan. They apply to everybody. Within our own communities, we can then begin to express our aspirations for the kind of people we want to be. And going back to, again, earlier talks, I think that this is a theme. I mean, is the way we view disability, the way we treat disability, does it say about us, what we wanted to say? Are we the kind of people that should be doing this? What do we? So we try and express our fundamental values, probably at a constitutional level or in some sort of charter. Human rights, of course, are very dominant in Europe when we do this, but human dignity is important too. And then we have, within our particular communities, we have a rather messy business where we have disagreements, we have different views, legitimate differences, but they don't engage our fundamental values, they don't engage the global commons, but there's still something we have to have governance of. And there we're just looking for some sort of acceptable accommodation. So within each of our communities, the ethical plurality has kind of free reign, and the way that will shape up, well, is anybody's guess. The one thing that is a constant is that we need to preserve and maintain the global commons. The trouble is the conditions of the global commons are strictly neutral between different kinds of community and different kinds of ethics. And although that is the one terra firma I think we can rely on in sort of rational debate, that these conditions are sacrosanct, because without them, well, we just don't have a debate. We're just not here. And although, as I say, that's the best possible kind of argument. That's the right, if you're looking for right answers, this is where you find them. They don't support a particular point within the bioethical triangle. They're neutral. And the only juice I could really extract from that would be that we shouldn't try to crowd out conscience too much, so that our policies and practices on conscientious objection should be generous to those who, in good faith, do have conscientious objection. So, to wind this up, 4 things, 4 quick points, just in conclusion. The first is that, living with the plurality is a challenge. I mean, it's better than there being a dearth of ethics, but it's almost a sense why we have, it's not too much ethics, but it's the conflicts and tension between the ethics that we have. And it's a problem, a challenge for both those who have governance responsibilities, who find themselves between rocks and hard places, and those who are governed, where the complexion of the the pattern of the plurality doesn't actually support the view that they want to see written into the law. Nevertheless, second point, we do need to maintain a civilized debate. Even though we have our differences, we need to maintain a civilized debate. Until quite recent, Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Sumption published a book last year called Law in a Time of Crisis, in which he makes this point several times, that we have our disagreements in democracies, but we have to find civilized ways of living with those disagreements. Okay. And the third thing, and this is the reality check, which is that we cannot expect that the legal position will always reflect our preferred ethical view. You know, I mean, Heidi's team are disappointed by the outcome of the judicial review. I understand that. You know, I've mentioned before that assisted suicide is something I've campaigned on. I was extremely disappointed when Lord Faulkner's bill back in 2014, 2015 was, you know, resoundingly voted out in the House of Commons. You know, had an excellent debate in the House of Lords the year before, and it had the Supreme Court as well, almost holding a gun to Parliament and saying you have to give this argument, you know, serious consideration because it could be incompatible with human rights if you maintain this prohibition on assisted suicide. So I'm disappointed about that, but we have to live with it. We have to live with it. And then, okay, final point is that, again, to repeat what I said along the way, I do find the gap between the 1967 Act and the practice today a worry. Not so much because where I stand on the, you know, whether I'm kind of pro-life or pro-choice or whatever, is I don't think this is good for the rule of law, that you've got such a gap like this. And so I do think it is time to reset the 1967 Act. I don't know what that reset, I mean, the resetting would take full account of all the issues relating to abortion, and nothing will be off the table. And we would be looking at all the techniques and all the rest of it that are available today for termination and for identifying the genetic profile of the fetus. Yeah, that would all have to be part of the conversation. I have no idea how that would shake down, but the fact I don't have any idea how that would come out seems to me to be an even better reason for saying we need to have a national conversation about this and try and get an abortion law that we might not all agree with it, we might not all endorse it, but in the end, you know, it's been the kind of conversation that enables us to say we do at least respect the governance in this particular case, even if we don't agree with the outcome. That's it. Thanks very much.